Absolutely. And the way to do it would be to, as quickly as your entity allows you to do, is to basically adopt a new or revised preference policy. So I mean, the best practical advice I can give is to say, with the best speed that you can muster within your organization. And I know that that is saying a lot, because some of these entities must go to their boards and things like that. It's not an easy thing, but as quickly as you possibly can, get your preferential policy kind of basically cleaned up. I mean, you can do it. And this is, if we go back to the judgment now, Sean, I think this is what's quite interesting. You also showed one of those extracts, which I think is very interesting, for me, very frustrating, because the majority judgment is just not clear. So they flip-flop around, what exactly is the meaning of 2171 versus 2, which is the big, elephant in the room. That's the big question we want answered. The SCA went one direction. I disagree with their direction, but at least they dealt with it. The CC now is really just flip-flopping over that question. So early in the majority judgment, they make very general remarks about, we agree with the minority about the objectives, but they don't go into the detail. And then later on, they make this odd statement in paragraph 116, and I think you also had it on the screen at some point, where the majority says, happily, both the first judgment and this judgment, and indeed the minister, understand the impugned regulations, so those are the 2017 regulations, to do what is envisaged in section 2172 of the Constitution. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean, if you're now an organ of state and you're thinking about, okay, so what are my options? I've now got the power. What can I do with that power? And I think that's the question that Ron's also just asked.
Right.
Does paragraph 116 now mean that you can simply take the 2017 regs as they are, and you say, oh, I quite like this. I want to continue doing this as is. I don't care about the fact that the minister came up with this, and we know now that he wasn't meant to impose it on me, but I like this, so I now adopt this. Is that almost kind of offhand statement in in paragraph 116 a mandate for you to then say, well, the Constitutional Court has said that these impugned regulations do what is envisaged in section 2172 of the Constitution. With other words, by implication, they are constitutionally sound, which is a big question. I mean, a lot of time was spent in both those courts arguing exactly that point. To what extent does this whole notion of pre-qualification, reservation, mandatory subcontracting, to what extent is it aligned with the constitutional wording in 2172, which on one reading suggests preference, but on another reading is a little bit more open-ended? We don't know.
But if we're suggesting that organs of state quickly update the SCM policies and the preferential procurement policies, at least this is a starting point, right? There might be some debate down the road if there is a challenge, but at least it gives them a starting point.
Absolutely, and that's also why, I mean, I said to somebody yesterday in one of these conversations that I wonder, and I've not checked who's on the call, it might be relevant people on the call, but I wonder whether what are they called? Afri-Business. I wonder whether they realize that they've actually not won. I wonder if they understand that.
One of those
they've actually lost.
Implications, yeah,
absolutely. So their intention was to do away with pre-qualification. That was really their big intention. Well, I don't think they've succeeded in that. All they've done is they've made it much more difficult to fight it. Because now, whereas up to this point, they had to fight it nationally at one point. Going forward, they'll have to fight it at, I mean, Sean, you
at a tender level, on this, right?
Yeah, at a tender level, at an
Yeah.
entity level. How
Yeah.
many entities do we now have that's got
720
individual?
plus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they've got 720 plus potential challenges ahead of them. And many of those could be much more strict than anything we had in the regs. And I
Yeah.
can tell you now, a conversation we've been having over and over again since 2011 has been, what does localization mean? Does it mean South African, or
Yeah.
does it mean Cape Town
Gauteng,
or Gauteng? Or what does it mean?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And we all know, we all know that outside of national government department thinking, every entity in this country wants that word localization to be much more narrow,
Right.
for their own purposes. And I see little reason why, given the power that's now been handed back to these entities, they cannot experiment with that. They cannot say, I am the municipality of Stellenbosch, and I'm just going to put into my tender now, into my policy,
Your preference
I'm going to write in, a pre-qualification criteria that allows me to preference bidders not from underdeveloped areas generally, but from underdeveloped areas in Stellenbosch.
Right. Right. Prof, let's just unpack, if we can, all the references to 2.1.
Yes.
And just so everyone is clear what 2.1 says.
Yes.
And I have for 3 years now been asking people in our training workshops to read 2.1. So fascinating to see this. I don't know if you have it open. I can from memory.
I do. I have it in front of me. Yes. So 2.1 says an organ of state must determine its preferential procurement policy and implement it within the following framework. Right. So this is really what was the basis of the majority judgment. That power is under 2.1 now explicitly and in a mandatory fashion given to entities, right, to organs of state. So they must both determine and implement. So the power to make, to create, formulate, and to administer, to run with it, are both in the hands of the organ of state. And then there's a framework to be given. And it's really there where the majority says, well, if the legislature gave that power to organs of state, we cannot interpret the statute as suggesting that the legislature would also have given this very same power to another entity, in this case, the minister. And it's on that basis that the court then the majority then held as it did. So,
which is also, interestingly enough, reflected in section 2172.
Yes.
That says the organ of state must determine its policy.
Absolutely.
And then refers to 3, where it says that framework must be nationally legislated. In this case, the framework is the Act.
Yes. So I think
there's no problem with the Act.
Well,
I mean,
I'm
as
not
far
so
as these
sure.
readings are concerned.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on whether you agree with that reading.
Okay.
I think, again, reflecting on the discussion you and I had yesterday, I think for me, in the end, it's a question of degree. It's not so clear cut because, yes, we can certainly agree that under the Act and under the Constitution, the power is granted to an organ of state, sure. But at the same time, then, surely we must agree that both those sources also subject the power to a framework, right? So it's throughout contemplated that it's not an open-ended discretion. Organs of state won't have a free hand. They will be bounded. There will be parameters. So I think in the end, the question is less a simple one of power, as the majority would have us believe, and more one of what is the ambit, or what are the parameters within which the framework can be created. And I think this is where the real difficulty lies, that perhaps the 2017 regulations went too far and can no longer be viewed as a framework, since it's simply a prescript. It's a set of rules, right? It's no longer a framework. It's so prescriptive
Mm.
that one cannot talk about a framework anymore. But that's why I think something like the 2001 regulations might have a fighting chance, because it did just create a framework. It didn't prescribe in detail to entities to say, you know, when you calculate your 20 preference points, this is exactly how you should do it. It just gave
You could
the
decide
parameters
how much
within.
black women,
Yeah.
how much youth,
Yeah.
you could decide that.
Yeah. So I think, you know, the real point of disagreement for me in reading both the Constitution and the PPPA against the majority judgment interpretation is that they don't give enough credit to what is contemplated. And if we go back to 2.1 again, it is very clear in 2.1 that it does contemplate regulations by the minister in this very space, right? So firstly, 2.1 says within the following framework, right? So it clearly qualifies the power. And then when we go and look at that framework that is prescribed by the Act,
A, B, C, D.
Yeah, all of
F,
that.
Yeah, yeah.
A number of places you will see it refers to things like as prescribed.
Yeah.
Now that word prescribed is defined in the statute to refer to this very thing, i.e. regulations.
So the threshold of the 80-20 as
The
prescribed.
threshold, for example.
Yeah.
So even on that very basic reading, right? And again, in C, if you look at C, in accordance with a prescribed formula. So that nice little formula that we've had right from the start, right? The
91 minus PT minus P min divided by P min, all that stuff. Yeah.
That thing that I always have to kind of, before I do any training, I have to work out my examples that I'm sure I get to the right numbers. That prescript in the regulations is, in my view, explicitly mandated in Section 2.1. I don't see how you can read Section 2.1c any other way.
That formula doesn't exist in the Act.
No, no. And again, an entity under the Act cannot formulate its own SCM, its own preference policy in the absence of that prescribed formula. So it's a given that there must be this prescribed formula. In the absence of it, what are you going to do? You don't have the power. The Act says you must do so in accordance with a prescribed formula. So you can't come up with your own formula.
Rafa, I know there are a couple of questions, and I wanted to just ask 2 questions, but you wanted to finish something. Sorry, I interrupted there.
No. So let me just, just that one thought. So
sure.
So the majority is curiously silent on that part of 2.1.
Yeah.
And they don't explain to us, if they take this categorical view that the minister just cannot make regulations, it's beyond his powers. Well, what about those bits? Do we just ignore them? So that's my problem with the lack of nuance in the majority judgment.
That prescription, can it be affected through an instruction, or would that also have to go through a regulatory process, a regulations process?
No, it can't, unfortunately, not be through instruction, simply because the PPPA defines prescribed to mean prescribed by regulation under Section 5.
Yeah.
So it must be regulatory.
Yeah. Because we're getting questions in the chat now saying, should we now just wait for National Treasury to tell us what to do? Let's wait for a directive from them. Can they actually do anything right now? Can they? They can't issue an instruction, right? They can't issue a circular.
No.
They have no power to.
No, one would hope that they will give us guidance. As in immediately, because we need, everybody needs to have their hands held now a little bit, because we don't know. And it'll be even bigger chaos if we all start running around and doing strange things. So I would very much expect that all the treasuries in the country are scrambling at the moment and having very intense discussions with their lawyers about what do we just do? And I very much expect to see some indication, right? And I think one should just give them a little bit of time, because this is not an easy matter. And one would, given that they've now basically lost, that they would want to make certain. So I think that is the prudent approach. But I would very much expect to have some communication from various quarters, national treasury, but also provincial treasuries, to give entities an indication. What should you do now? At an entity level, my advice would be just play for time as much as you can for the next week or so. Don't rush things now. This may turn out to be quite problematic. We know that the interests that's been driving this whole litigation didn't do so for academic reasons. They will undoubtedly be scrutinizing very closely the actual procurement spend happening now. So I would say, hang tight, as unpalatable as that may be. It is unpalatable, but it is what it is. Hang tight. Let's see what guidance we get. But apart from that, as you say, Sean, I mean, as things stand, the National Treasury's hands are actually really tied in terms of what they can practically do, because even regulations is not something you can easily just quickly
take some time.
It takes some time, as we're seeing now with the disaster. I mean, the president has told us it ends next month, but you can't get regulations in place soon enough. And it's the same scenario here. And as a complete aside, I mean, that's why I was bitterly disappointed yesterday that the court didn't realize this practical nightmare and didn't give us a few months of suspension. At least 6 months. I mean, that's the very least that they could have done. I don't know, perhaps National Treasury's lawyers would advise them to urgently approach the court again, and
so
say,
they can possibly do that. They can go back and
say, I mean,
they don't necessarily appeal, but they can ask for some clarity or something to just
help us out here. I mean, it's really very, very strange, but we've seen it, for example, in the Zuma case, where the court has said, okay, well, under certain circumstances, we will think about something again. I don't know. I mean, I'm not a litigator. I'm not a litigator, so I won't advise on that. But perhaps Treasury's lawyers would say, let's at least try that, to at least squeeze a suspension out of the CC, to say, okay, we don't want you to change this thing, but just suspend your order for 6 months to give us time. That might be the quickest solution. In the meantime, entities, I think, at their level must work as quickly as they can to get their own policies
no matter
independent.
What, the regulations are gone.
The regulations,
in the current form, they're gone. So there is a need to start going through and doing some work on the policy.
Absolutely.
There could be some refinements, some hints, some ideas from Treasury that come through on what to include and not to include, and hopefully, to avoid one of the unintended consequences, you have to try and maybe get some consistency.
So I would say, as an entity, your biggest risk now is to run with an SCM policy, and with that I basically refer to the preference part, that is too closely tied to the now defunct 2017 regs. That's your risk. Anything you can do to move away from that risk is in your best interest.
We've got a couple of questions. Ron Grace asked, and I see he's unmuted, how does the public entity maximize the discretion provided to make its own policy in general and for individual specifications? Good morning, Ron. Do you want to come in?
Good morning, Sean. Perhaps I can make my question very practical. So here, I hear different views, and the court could have gone either way, etc., etc. Just as a practitioner, we have to do something from day zero, which is 1 minute past 10 yesterday. And what I am thinking of suggesting to our organization is that as a temporary measure, we purely remove any reference to the regulations. I'm speaking purely about the reference, not the content, i.e. we as an organization technically adopt as a temporary measure with all the caveats that they involve, that as our policy.
Yeah.
The same with our specification template, there's no reference to the regulations, but we technically adopt as a temporary measure those. Secondly, and this for me is the exciting part of the judgment. Whatever one thinks of the judgment, the exciting part is it gives discretion back to us.
Yes.
And you gave a good example about localization. So for me, the second part is to say, look, we'll temporize by just removing the technical references. We'll still keep the substance, but it now opens the door for us to sit down and say we are unfettered. We have the exciting discretion. We have such remarkable talent within the NRF, with our scientists and researchers, etc. You know, just to say, guys, you know, we go to the outermost parts of the universe with our research. Let's now go to the outermost parts with our transformation policy. We're not now fettered or have these blinkers on, but we can really just brainstorm and have the freedom to come up with something ourselves. Here, what would your advice be on that approach?
Yeah. Check and check, Ron. Absolutely. I think your first proposal, absolutely sensible. Just to keep, you know, the train rolling. I think that is safe. To be able to show if there's subsequently then a challenge to say that, no, we didn't follow these rules because we just blindly relied on these. No, this is a conscious decision we took using our power, as the court has said we've got. So yes, I think that is fine. I think the only risk there, Ron, is your own internal procedural requirements to get something like that approved. But you know, that would be entity to entity, and I'm sure there would be ways to expedite something like that as an interim measure. Absolutely. And then you're right. I mean, you're absolutely right that at an entity level, I fully agree that the exciting part is that the ball is now in your court. So you no longer you are no longer restricted. The one difficulty that I would say that I've really been beating my head to get around this, but the one difficulty is that requirement in section 2(1)(c) around a prescribed formula. Because clearly that's not within your power. Clearly, the formula is in the minister's power. And now there is no formula. Look, I mean, I think one would probably just continue using the one we've had right from the start and just say, look, in the absence of anything new, this is the best we can do. There is definitely a legal issue there, but it's it's one of those legal issues where, you know, what else do you want us to do? Do you want us to do nothing? Surely that can't be a better option. Yeah. So that would be my view, but I fully agree with your comments.
Prof, not to throw cold water on the excitement, but 2(1) still stands, which is the framework. So it still needs to be within the basic framework that's there. So don't necessarily say we're now going to do 70-30.
No. Okay. Very important point, right, Sean. That's a very, very important point. So absolutely remember the 80-20-90-10 never came from the regs. It's in the act itself. So that you are stuck with. But that's why I think the remarks in paragraph 116 of the judgment is so important. Yeah. Because it at least suggests, it doesn't hold, but it at least suggests that going beyond the 80-20, going beyond, with other words, the preference element, to adopt additional mechanisms like pre-qualifications or subcontracting or whatever else you can come up with might be constitutionally permissible.
Targeting.
So yeah, so you can't just you can't jettison the preference part. That kind of that thing you're stuck with. But around it, I think there's a lot of freedom now.
Right.